Hi there, and welcome to the 36th Annual Veg Food Fest, brought to you by the Toronto Vegetarian Association, also known as the TVA. My name is Lainey, and I'm the Festival and Events Coordinator here at the TVA. I just wanted to say thank you so much for spending your time and joining us at all of our awesome demos and talks that we have available on this platform. So I encourage you to grab a snack and sit back for some great discussions. I'd like to introduce our next talk with Carol J. Adams and the new edition of her book, The Pornography of Meat, interviewed by Paul Steller and Andy Tabar, who are the co-hosts of the podcast The Bearded Vegan. In the edition updated for 2020, The Pornography of Meat has more than 340 additional images and continues the discussion of the complex relationship of the meat industry and misogyny. It reflects on more recent events, including the Me Too movement and the rise of acts of terrors that are carried out by white supremacist groups. Carol is a feminist scholar and activist whose written work explores the cultural construction of overlapping and interconnected oppressions, as well as the ethics of care. Her first book, The Sexual Politics of Meat, is now celebrating its 30th anniversary. She is currently working on a memoir of her mother based on her essay from the New York Times, Finding Myself in My Mother's Calendars. Paul Steller and Andy Tabar started the podcast The Bearded Vegans with a desire to move beyond the basics of Vegan 101 and spark a more nuanced discussion for the seasoned vegan. It's a place for honest and often uncomfortable discussions about the ethical gray areas of veganism, as well as the issues within the vegan community. Through these conversations, Paul and Andy are working towards creating a stronger, more effective, and inclusive animal rights movement. They rarely reach any solid conclusions, but they certainly have a lot of fun and share many laughs along the way. To keep the TVA going for another 75 years and more, please become a member. You'll get the Toronto Veg Card, which gives you 5 to 20% off at over 120 restaurants, stores, and other businesses across the GTA. You'll get our quarterly magazine, Lifelines, and be a part of our amazing community. Special for this year's Veg Food Fest, it is only $10 to sign up as a new member, or $15 if you're renewing, courtesy of Mahan Thacker. Plus, everyone who joins or renews this weekend will be entered into a draw to win a copy of Doug McNish's new cookbook, The Classics, Veganized. Click on the link below to get started. And please consider giving more if you can. You can visit us at veg.ca/donate or veg.ca/join for more information if you would like to contribute more. Thank you so much and keep enjoying all the videos.
All right, Carol, it is so wonderful to be speaking with you again. The last time we spoke was in front of a packed house at the Toronto Veg Fest. Things are a little different this time around, and we have a shorter time together. Anyone who listens to our podcast knows we're not really into the whole brevity thing, but we will try our best. So let's dive right into it.
So, Carol, on October 29th, you're going to be releasing an updated version of The Pornography of Meat, a book you originally published in 2004, and that is what we are here to talk about today. So, in the very first chapter, the chapter is titled, What is Pornography? And something I think a lot of people might take for granted or feel pornography is something that I think a lot of people might take for granted or feel is implicitly understood by the general population, but I think it would be helpful to define it at the start. So what is pornography, and how do you intend to use that term as it relates to the exploitation of animals?
Well, let's say that the pornography I'm talking about is, in Catherine McKinnon's terms, making inequality sexy. Pornography of objectification, dominance, violence, that figures men as dominant and women as submissive or receptive to violence is making inequality sexy. And it not only makes gender inequality sexy, it makes racial, class, ethnic inequality sexy, say featuring Asian women who want to be dominated, or African American women depicted as though they're still enslaved. So one of the epigraphs from in the Pornography of Meat is from Patricia Hill Collins, Black Feminist Thought, one of her books. She says, in contemporary pornography, women are objectified through being portrayed as pieces of meat, as sexual animals awaiting conquest. So we're also going to see in a book like mine how all the images and representations from animal agriculture present animals sexualized, awaiting conquest. But what Collins is trying to say is that it's not that pornography existed and Black women were kind of stirred in. It's that pornography as we know it evolved from a white supremacist culture that viewed the objectification of Black women's bodies as acceptable, normative, and natural in order to dominate them. And so we end up with media representations that is drawing on a pornography that got defined through white supremacy. So issues of objectification, dominance, control, animalization, and the mixing of violence and sex is all what concerns me. So in a sense, my book, The Pornography of Meat, is trying to show how these images and representations make inequality tasty.
So I think that, to put a point on it, would you say that like all pornography is inherently unethical, or like how do you define it in that way?
I think that there is often a confusion that, feminists who are talking about pornography are anti-sex, or, I've been labeled anti-pornography. And I always wonder, why aren't I labeled anti-sexual violence? Because that's what concerns me. In the last chapter of the book, I show these images that show animals having sex in a way that's selling meat or trying to take away the dissonance of pigs and transport trucks. In Europe, there's all these transport trucks that are showing pigs making bacon on the back, which is a complete lie. I mean, animals aren't having sex. Animals would like to have sex. So part of the pornographic figuring that I'm looking at is sexualized inequality that's confirmed through representations. I would like to believe that healthy sexuality can be expressed in a variety of ways. But my specific concern is really sort of anti-sexual violence and celebration of sexual exploitation.
Yeah, and certainly that chapter that you just mentioned, it was, in my opinion, one of the most highly disturbing chapters amongst, a huge collection of very disturbing imagery. And I certainly learned some things in there that even someone who's been around this, the exploitation of animals and knows the ins and out pretty intimately, it was still pretty shocking. But early on in the book, you wrote something that just really piqued my interest. You wrote, "The pornography of meat exploits the asymmetrical relationship of gender to normalize animal oppression, simultaneously naturalizing the gender binary and a consumer vision in which farmed animals are imputed to desire their own death and consumption," which there's so many ideas packed in there. It kind of summarizes a lot of the larger themes that we do find throughout the book. But I would like to start with that section, that little bit that you wrote about the gender binary, because as I was reading the book, I found that so much of the discussion was almost like forced into this binary, because it kind of felt like the advertisements that you're putting out there, like they don't leave room for a nuanced discussion about like the spectrum of gender. And in fact, you write, "Meat eating functions as a marker that legitimates the gender binary system." So could you explain what you mean by that?
Well, it's tied in with, what I called the sexual politics of meat back in, 30 years ago in that book. But it's, if we have an expectation that men are supposed to eat something special and women are supposed to eat something else, we're already participating in a gender binary that believes there are just men and women. instead of a gender continuum in which there are a variety of expressions. But it's as though men eating meat is a way of upholding and saying there are only two sexes and we are the ones who have the right to this. So you've got a very hierarchical gender binary, males more valued than females, meat more valued than vegetables. So, you know, it's like blue and pink. And there was even a wedding where there was different food for men and women. You know, the blue got meat and the women were getting fishes, dead fishes or vegetables. It's the rigidity of what's normative. So how do we know who men are, especially white men? Because there's a lot of whiteness, and I think that's something that I try to really make explicit in this book, that it's really reifying a certain normative white masculinity. But how do we know who they are? They eat meat. So men who don't eat meat, they become tarred by misogynistic terms. Pussies, cunts, homophobic slurs are used. So these are all signs that refusing meat is disturbing the gender binary. And you're going to reinforce and push the men back in. And one of the things that I think is so strange, you have to keep, you know, re-upping your man card. My library card's good for years, but the man card's destabilized by, you know, a vegetarian breakfast.
Yeah, I think that also ties a lot into this other antiquated belief. I mean, it's very related to the whole, you know, real men eat meat. It's kind of slogan that's portrayed. So why do you think that meat eating has become so intertwined with masculinity and manhood? And how do these advertisements that you're portraying in the book, how do they reinforce that idea?
So first we have to remember that the majority of the world did not eat meat on a daily basis for you know, millennia. And that really what we have is a Western racist belief about protein, that it has to come from dead animals or from mammalian milk and chickens' eggs. But once you've got this fixation on the sort of status of meat eating, both from class and race perspectives, then if you eat meat, as especially a white man, say in the 19th century, it could be acting as a proxy for loss of status during the increase in industrialization and capital and the growth of capitalism. So, for instance, white working class workers of the late 19th century, they didn't get better wages, but they got lower priced meat. So that would be an example that real men eat meat, and so you're being assuaged at one level while you're being deprived of rights on another, in a sense. But a masculinity made anxious and unsettled seeks to reestablish itself by invoking red meat. And one of the things I try to show in the book is it's not just the 19th century, it's after the Vietnam War, it's after 9/11, it's during the Trump candidacy and in his presidency that this appears over and over again.
It is pretty amazing, the like two extremes that kind of masculinity exist in, and that it's portrayed as like really tough and macho and take them all. But the slightest infraction, I think an example in the book was like serving appetizers to your friends or something like that, that can like shatter this masculinity. And it's amazing that it exists in these two vastly different extremes. And it seems like one of the ways that the vegan movement tries to tackle this is to turn that phrase on its head, sort of by saying real men eat plants. So I'm wondering, like, in general, how do you feel the vegan movement is doing combating a lot of the issues that you bring up in this book?
Not too well, sadly. I mean, I think that the problem is when we do real men eat plants, well, you're still supporting what real men are. What are real men? You know, why aren't we destabilizing masculinity and saying there is this whole continuum of gender expression, and however you want to do it, eating plants is better for you, or eating plants is better for the animals, or, you know, because back to eating plants is better for you. I'm always worried about that sort of narcissistic recrimination that occurs. You know, it's all about your health. And I think the bottom line for veganism is it's about the animal's health. So I see those things as regressive. And I think it also feels that, or shows that so often what we're doing is trying to talk to white men once more. You know, really? I mean, why can't we have a more multifaceted approach rather than trying to address the destabilization of masculinity by food choices? Why don't we just accept that masculinity is destabilized and go from there?
So like, how would you respond then to, I mean, this could happen both in someone in the vegan movement that says to you, well, real men eat plants, like that's not a big deal to say that. I mean, also just meat eaters in general will say, they could look at some of the advertisements that you put in the book and they're going to say, well, what's the big deal? It's all a joke. Like, how do you respond to, I mean, you might respond to the vegans differently than the meat eaters or similarly, I don't know, but how do you respond to that?
It's sort of like, after people watch the Sexual Politics of Meat slideshow where I show images, and I've got some of them on my website, and of course there's 340 in the book, all you have to do is look at one of them. And once you deconstruct what the message is, then you're going to see it in a different way. That's why people have sent me images from all around the world, because it's I hate to use the word paradigm shift, but it's a paradigm shift. So for instance, a headless woman called a silent woman, as in a restaurant by that name, that's misogyny. But a headless sexualized pig drawn with high heels, stockings, a bra, that's considered an advertisement. But she's dead and she's headless. So the misogynist trope about silent women gets a second win when applied to animals, reinforcing that they're available for use while also being able to laugh about women being available for use. So the joke is dominant humor from the dominant side about those who can be oppressed. So another one, Trump's grab him by the pussy. His explanation of how he sexually exploited women. And then look at the advertisements for barbecues with sexualized pigs inviting someone to give them a butt rub. It's saying, not only was what Trump said okay, but let's just joke about how we actually are looking at animals too. So I think it's not less dangerous, but more dangerous, because it's trying to create a sort of alibi for misogyny.
Well, speaking of alibis, you wrote animality offers oppression and alibi. A racist, xenophobic, homophobic, transphobic, and misogynist worldview functions within a human-animal binary. So there's another binary for you right there. So could you expand on that a little bit more? And I guess especially how it relates to all the advertisements that you are showing in the book.
And just a footnote, they're not only advertisements. Some of them are, representations from newspapers or a variety of ways, so that it's not just they're selling a product. All of these representations are selling oppression. And so animality is this concept that there is something that is animal-like. And first we applied animality to animals, that animals aren't like us. Animals are the animal-like beings. And then once we lowered them out of ethical consideration and put them down below, I didn't climb the food chain, the species hierarchy. I mean, it's all, back to the pornography of meat, it's all a kind of vertical phallic imagery right there. But once we lowered animals, any human being we want to oppress or group of humans we want to oppress, we already have an easy way of doing it. We compare them or say that they are animals or animal-like. Women were closer to animals because we had bodily functions, menstruation and pregnancy and birth. Africans were closer to animals. All the myths and lies of white supremacy that justified enslaving human beings as property, those all many of them relied on this kind of myth of animality, homophobia, transphobia, anything, any oppressive attitude. It already gets traction. It's kind of like it's already moved to a mile ahead, because all it has to do is say you're animal-like. Look at Trump on immigrants. He's always calling them animal-like or beasts or whatever. It's xenophobia gravitates to animality in a frightening way right now. So that's the alibi, I think.
Yeah. So another one of the ideas that you bring up in the book that I thought was fascinating was this idea of suicide food, and you talk about that in that chapter "Eat Me," where you're exploring the notion that these advertisements, and like you said, it's more than just advertisements, but slogans, T-shirts, menu items, everything. They present this world in which the animals want to be in, and they desire to be used by us. So, can you tell us more about this, like suicide food, that idea?
So Suicide Food was a website that was curated by a young person named Ben. I corresponded with him for several years. He's left it up, but he has stopped adding to it. I think it's overwhelming to get these images. And so Suicide Food depicts animals as wanting to be consumed. And this is what's so weird about anthropocentrism and human-centeredness. Animals have no will, they have no desires, we can do whatever we want to them, and yet when dead they want to be eaten. It's I think what it does is it reveals the kind of fissure in meat eaters' minds that they can't deal with, and so they put off the denial of the animal's will and recreate it as desire to be consumed. And of course, once you're showing all these animals as female, all the trinkets and clothing that's associated with female oppression, you've got this doubling of oppression, and you've got this reinforced message: come and eat me, consume me, either literally or visually, but here I am. And it removes all the agency. No, I'm not responsible. I, the meat eater, the dairy consumer, I'm not responsible for this animal's suffering. This is what they want. I mean, it's kind of a classic part of rape culture.
I did find it really, I mean, there's something that comes with looking at page after page after page of all of these things where you very nicely lay out the themes and consistent tropes that you kind of see, one of which being that the animals are consistently, almost exclusively depicted as women characters. And usually if there is a male character in there, it's like one that's having sex with the female. And I don't know what to make of this, but it was just so interesting that when you pointed out that you can't put a human man in there, because then all of a sudden it shifts it into the territory of bestiality. But absent that, all of a sudden it's totally fine, and it's totally this like salacious or funny kind of imagery. I don't know if that's like something you could elaborate on a little bit.
So just to back up and say that when The Sexual Politics of Meat came out 30 years ago, within 2 weeks, people started sending me images. And the original book only had like 3 negative images, 3 oppressive images, but people got it and they started sending it to me. And I'd collect things and I'd look at advertisements. So an example of that would be this advertisement for clothing in which this woman is lying on the ground with her legs up, and there's a man standing next to her looking down. So you've got dominance and control and perhaps hinting at violence. Well, I found that same image, the woman's knees being up, the exact same layout is in ads for chickens or pigs. And they're in that same position lying down, but the man is absent. The man has to be inferred. Who's the dominant one? Because bestiality is supposed to be taboo. Later in that last chapter that you said was so disturbing, I cite the work of a scholar who shows how all these bestiality laws have to not apply to farms, because so much of what animal agriculture does today could almost be seen as bestial because they're impregnating animals. So bestiality is this taboo. We know that taboos are made sexy to begin with. So it's again this hint and playing with dominance and violence in what's supposed to be just an ad for a dead chicken dinner.
So Carol, we could talk to you for hours, but unfortunately our time is fast approaching, coming to the end. So the Pornography of Meat, it was originally published in 2004, and The Sexual Politics of Meat, 1990. And so one of the last things we wanted to ask was, are things changing? Are things getting better? Are you tired of people sending you representations of sexism in food advertisements? And just more generally, what made you feel like this book needed this update?
Well, in one sense, things you could say are getting better. People recognize the word vegan. We've got more vegan entrees. Certainly the pandemic has brought to attention the problem of animal agriculture and zoonotic diseases. That's a terrible way to have something be positive. So the images I'm getting are so much more salacious. Again, I'm not dealing with, sort of what would be typically labeled pornography, but we always have to remember that pornography has a budget 5 times, 10 times, 100 times more than all the Hollywood films together, all the dominant media together. I didn't even go there for the terrible bloodiness that they do about animals and women. I was sticking with popular culture, and that's getting worse. The trucks in Europe is an example, the barbecue images, the fun over dominance, which I think is a reaction to animal rights activism and veganism, because, come back strong. I also think that misogyny found safety in a Trump, and it's being allowed to be expressed. I think white masculinity has been affirmed, and white masculinity, so we've got right-wing and militia and Nazis claiming the importance of meat, and there's this fluidity between that and that traditional real men eat meat, which is scary. In terms of getting these images, I just got 3 this week. I always think, well, I'm done. I've done the 25th anniversary of the Sexual Politics of Meat. I'm done. And I got so many images after that. And then when I was asked, did I want the Pornography of Meat, here is the cover, to enter the Revelations series at Bloomsbury, which is where Sexual Politics of Meat is, I looked at it and I said, I can't just bring this out. 2003, so much has happened. These images are so much more frequent, and also they're so individualized. I coined this term chalk misogyny for chalkboards outside of food restaurants, and around the world they're sexist. And food trucks. So food trucks move. Usually we have to walk past something or drive past a billboard, but food trucks come to us. So this visual oppression is being spread more widely. And I felt like, well, maybe this is the last one where I really bring it up to date, make sure I'm talking about the issues that animal rights scholars and critical race scholars and feminist scholars have brought forth. For instance, look at fat phobia as it's expressed against animals and the relationship with racism there. So I just felt like, okay, let's do it one more time, bring it all up to date, make the case about how dangerous this is, and that the vegan movement has to understand how the oppression of animals is embedded within these other oppressive frameworks. So I guess for right now, I might be done, but I've already started a file that says, 2020 after June, new images. And it's already got 10 images in it. So
hopefully in 20 years, you'll put out a new edition that says, we did it. It's over.
I know. I'm an author who wants her work to not be relevant. How many authors do you get to talk to I wish this were not relevant.
Mm-hmm.
So,
can I just say that Bloomsbury has made a special offer for anybody listening to this and anybody coming to the Toronto Veg Fest, the virtual edition, that if you go to the Bloomsbury website until October 31st, you can get a copy of The Pornography of Meat for 35% off and not support Amazon.
Perfect.
So it's, you need to put in T Veg Fest 2020.
Very nice. And you just kind of alluded to this, I guess, conflict within the movement. There's obviously some people that say we need to focus only on the animals. Like that's the only thing, and sort of every other kind of social cause be damned. We just need to tackle straight ahead. And then obviously you have many people that are saying we need an inclusive view. Some people call it intersectional or radical veganism or whatever. How do you respond to that if someone says like, yeah, this is all bad, but like the animals have it the worst, or we can't tackle everything, that's going to overwhelm people? How do you kind of respond to that?
If the animals are being oppressed because of misogyny, white supremacy, xenophobic, racist attitudes, how do we release them from their oppression if we don't tackle all the forces surrounding them? That's the whole issue of animality. And also, I'm not looking to live in a vegan world that hasn't dealt with its whiteness, hasn't dealt with its misogyny. That's no vegan world I'm working for.
I think we maybe have time for one more question. Andy, you got one more?
Well, I was just going to ask, like, how do you make that manageable? Tackling it seems like such a huge thing, tackling so many oppressions. What can the listener, the watcher, what can we do about it? Are there concrete steps, or like, what do you think are meaningful ways to sort of navigate this?
Well, do we have another 30 minutes? I'm always worried when we say this is what's best for the animals, and it's like who's decided what's best for the animals? I think we know that every vegan meal is a boycott of animal agriculture, and I've always felt that teaching veganism and spreading veganism by presenting yourself as a non-anxious vegan who loves to be vegan, it has its own role. And we often forget that grassroots activism and grassroots people are the source of so much change. One thing is to be committed to your vegan animal rights activism, but learn enough to know that you aren't promoting white values in your veganism or male-oriented values. If we are educated about how to prepare vegan foods, we should be equally educated about how to prepare vegan arguments. It doesn't take any longer than the deep dive we've done into vegan recipes. My God, the vegan recipes on the web. Well, let's do some deep dives so that we stop stepping on other people's toes. Well, we're not going to have a vegan world if we aren't recognizing the kinds of oppressions people experience in their lives that militate against veganism.
Carol, it is always wonderful and delightful and just enlightening to talk to you. Thank you so much for enlightening us today.
Paul and Andy, I just want to thank you for the Bearded Vegans, your podcasts. I want to put in a plug. Anyone who hasn't listened to the 2-part podcast on Thug Kitchen should sit down and do that after you've not going to the Veg Fest. It's must listening. And thank you both for your steadiness, moving through all the questions and controversies that we all live with.
Thanks, Carol.
Thank you, Carol.